Hello kids! Have you heard of homophones? Well, homophones are words which have the same pronunciation but different meaning. For example, the word SEAC, which means a big water body, and the word SEEC, which means to look or to visit. Let me explain by taking an example. He went to the sea to see his friend. In this sentence, the first C is SEA and the second C, SEE, is to visit. Today, I'll narrate a story about our dear Mr. Twiddle who is confused with the word. Children, the story that I'm going to read out to you today is about the confusion caused by the homophone Pear. Our dear Mr. Twiddle all the time is referring to pear as in fruit, whereas the shopkeeper thinks that Mr. Twiddle is out to buy a pair of shoes. Listen and enjoy. Mr. Twiddle's Pear. Once Mr. Twiddle went out walking by himself, for it was a very fine day indeed. Twiddle's feet got very hot walking, and he wished he had put on his big boots. He felt very thirsty too, and wondered if Sally Simple would let him have a drink when he passed her house. I'll ask her, he thought. He walked along down the road and came to the shops. Next door to the boot shop, there was a fine pear tree overhanging the street wall. On it was several green pears, nearly ripe. Mr. Twiddle stared at them in delight. Now a pear to eat, a nice juicy pear when he was almost dying of thirst, would be simply lovely. He wondered if he could call in at the boot shop and ask the man to let him have one of the pears off the pear tree. But he didn't quite like to do that. So he stood at the door of the shop and turned over the boots that were for sale on his big stall in front of the door. The shopkeeper saw him and came forward. He bowed to Mr. Twiddle and spoke to him politely. "What can I do for you this morning, sir? Would you like one of those pears?" He meant, of course, would Twiddle like a pair of the boots and shoes he was looking at. But Twiddle's mind was full of the pears hanging over the wall. His heart gave a jump of joy when he heard the shopkeeper say that, and he smiled all over his face. "Would I like a pear?" he said, beaming. "I should just think I would. How nice of you to suggest it." "Well," said the shopkeeper, "you're a very polite customer, I must say. Now what kind of a pear would you like? What color? Black or brown?" Mr. Twiddle felt a bit puzzled. He hadn't heard of black pears before. He thought brown ones might be a bit overripe. So he looked at the shopkeeper and said, "Well, Mr. Shopkeeper, I think I would really rather have a yellow pear, if you don't mind. I always like them best." The shopkeeper pursed up his lips and frowned. "Well, I'm sorry, sir, but I haven't a single yellow pear today," he said. "They're all black or brown. But come in this afternoon, and maybe I'll have one for you. I can send to the other end of town to my brother. He may have a fine yellow pear." "Oh, pray don't bother to do that," said Mr. Twiddle. He looked at the green pears on the tree. Well, a green pear would do quite well, you know. They are a little bit hard, that's the only thing. Yellow ones are nice and soft." The shopkeeper began to think. Mr. Twiddle was just a little mad. "I haven't any green pears today," he said gruffly. "You come along in an hour and I'll have a yellow pear for you. What size would you like?" "Oh, as large as possible, please," said Twiddle, eagerly thinking how lovely it would be to sink his teeth into an enormous ripe yellow pear and taste the sweet juice. The shopkeeper looked down at Mr. Twiddle's feet. They didn't look very large to him. "All right," he said, "a large yellow pear. And would you like a laced pear or a buttoned pear?" Mr. Twiddle stared at the shopkeeper, thinking that he must be a little mad. He had never in his life heard of a pear with laces or buttons. After all, if you wanted to, you took the skin off a pear. You didn't unbutton or unlace it. "He will be asking if I want hooks and eyes on it next," thought Twiddle. Really, he is a most peculiar man. "I don't think I want my pear laced or buttoned," said Twiddle. "Just plain, if you know what I mean." "I see," said the shopkeeper, not seeing at all. "Well, do you want a tongue?" Of course, he meant, did Twiddle want a tongue inside his shoes? But Twiddle didn't know that. He stared again at the shopkeeper and felt a little angry. "Do I want a tongue?" he said. "Well, haven't I been talking with my tongue all this time? Why should I want another? Look, here is mine. Goodbye. I'll come back in an hour's time for a nice yellow pear without laces or buttons and with no tongue." Mr. Twiddle had put out his tongue to show the shopkeeper he had one, and the shopkeeper thought he was being rude. He gazed after Twiddle and shook his head. "He seemed such a nice man at first," he said, "but he must be mad, quite mad. Well, I'll send over to my brother's and see if he has got a nice yellow pair of boots or shoes without laces, buttons or tongues." His brother did have a pair. They were bright yellow shoes with elastic sides. He was glad to get rid of them because he hadn't been able to sell them. The shopkeeper who had talked to Twiddle looked out for him in an hour's time, and sure enough, there he was, coming back to see if he really could have a nice juicy yellow pear. "Good day again," called the shopkeeper. "I've got that yellow pear for you, just your size too. Look." Twiddle stared in dismay at the bright yellow shoes. He simply couldn't bear them. He knew Mrs. Twiddle wouldn't like them either. "Why are you offering me shoes?" he said in astonishment. "I meant a pear to eat, like those growing on that tree over there. I was thirsty. Couldn't you give me one of those pears? I don't want this pair of shoes. They are dreadful." That made the shopkeeper very angry. "They are fine shoes," he cried. "You ordered them, didn't you? It's all very well for you to say you wanted a pair of that tree now. But what you asked me for was a pair of yellow shoes without laces, buttons or tongues. And here they are. Pay me for them, please." Now look here, began Mr. Twiddle, feeling rather frightened. "This won't do. I'll buy a pair of your tree, but I won't buy those yellow shoes. How much will you charge me for a pair of the tree?" "It's not my tree," said the shopkeeper, and he looked fiercely at Twiddle. "It doesn't grow in my garden. It grows next door. Now what about these shoes? They cost £10 and they are a bargain. Pay up, please, or I'll have to go and tell the policeman over there that you have been making fun of me and won't pay my bill." The policeman looked a bit fierce. Twiddle gave a deep sigh and felt in his pocket. He pulled out a handful of coins and showed them to the man. "That's all I've got," he said. "Well, it's 50 pence short," said the man, "but I'll let you off that. Do you want to put the shoes on now?" "Oh, no, thank you," said Mr. Twiddle quickly. "No, I'll carry them." So poor Twiddle went home with the bright yellow shoes and tried to hide them in the boot cupboard right at the very back. But Mrs. Twiddle caught sight of them before he put them there and called out in surprise, "Twiddle, are those yellow daffodils you have got? Put them in water, my dear man. Don't put them in the boot cupboard." So poor Twiddle had to show Mrs. Twiddle the shoes, and I really couldn't tell you what she said. It would fill this whole book and then want a few more pages besides. He hasn't worn the shoes yet, and I don't somehow think he ever will. He does make some funny mistakes, doesn't he?